Hello, and welcome to This is Cohousing, the Cohousing Podcast. I'm Charles Durrett, author and principal architect at the Cohousing Company. In today's episode, we're discussing culture change and the role of anthropology, in particular applied anthropology, in that quest. And since applied anthropologists have made such a big and important impact on Danish cohousing, it's about time for American audiences to appreciate what anthropologists have to say about cohousing. The three basic overarching components to co-housing design starts by asking the group exactly who are we as a culture, who do we want to become as a culture, and how are we going to implement those changes. My guest today is Richard Senghas. In the last 25 years, Richard's lived in two different co-housing that he helped start. And while all co-housings are not created equal, FrogSong and Cotati is rather exceptional. Richard, thank you so much for being here today.
I appreciate being invited on.
I have to say it was a great pleasure working with you and everybody else in that group.
It was fun.
I mean, to have an anthropologist in the group was just a blessing, frankly. And everybody else in the group was, I would argue, amateur anthropologists, even though they might not recognize it as that, in that they were also motivated to understand who we are as a culture. When studying co-housing in the course of writing the book, Creating Co-housing, Building Sustainable Neighborhoods, I interviewed 7 Danish applied anthropologists. It was fascinating, 7 interviews. And then I also interviewed an American anthropologist who was in the course of writing a book in Denmark about why the Danes successfully assimilated into the American culture. Almost every individual of the thousands of people I've worked with now who, of course, they put their individual needs on the table, like a balance between privacy and community. I get that. But they also put a lot of other desires, values on the table, like living lighter on the planet, like spontaneous understanding and socializing with my neighbors. A great deal of things that can begin to morph that subculture in a positive direction. And maybe someday we'll have a bigger impact on our bigger culture, especially since culture change is so central. In the long arc of culture change, many forces play a role. Technology of recent has played an oversized role, giving the power of devices and misinformation. Richard, since you have lived in co-housing as an anthropologist, how might we hope that co-housing might affect that arc in a positive direction?
I think one of the best aspects of co-housing, as it has to deal with what you're talking about, is that we intentionally, accidentally bump into each other constantly and consistently. We see each other as we're walking on the path, as we're going down to all the mailboxes. We don't know who we're going to bump into. We don't know what's going to cause us to have a conversation, but we're going to have a spontaneous, live, in-person conversation. And sometimes we'll even say, "Oh, I didn't understand that thing that went out in email." And the conversation in person ends up clearing that or deepening that in many ways. And I think that our society has removed these third spaces where everybody physically cross paths and see each other, and our bodily humanity is there as well as our emotional and intellectual. So I think co-housing is really strong that way. And I think getting back to that earlier point that you were making, it's the we, not the I. We're constantly being asked, "Who are you? Are you making your goals? What do you want?" And all that kind of thing. And we don't often enough talk about what are the different we's that we are all part of, because we have our own units, households, and we have our privacy and that particular space, and then there's the boundary of the front door, and then we are in another level of shared space, and then we have the more intentionally bigger shared spaces like the common house or open space. But it's not just a binary, it's these stages of different levels. We are simultaneously multiple different people in different sets of we's, and, I think that co-housing helps layer that in a lot. We have close friendships, but we also have acquaintances. If your community is big enough, you can't know everybody as intimately as everybody else, and so those who are inclined or have complementary temperaments and personalities, then we form natural groups, and those change over time as we age, or as we get into new things, or as some of us start to retire.
I mean, the shortest poem in the English language, which was written by Muhammad Ali, incidentally, in 1974, it's me, comma, we. You probably knew that. And every interpretation of the writing is that I will never reach my potential until we reach our potential.
Yeah.
And that resonates so much with how co-housing groups work. They simply segue from this place about me to I will never reach my potential until we do. And if we think about it a little bit, we can reach whole new potentials around saving money, about living lighter on the planet. It's just so real. I couldn't agree with you more. Richard, other than Margaret Mead and Robert Bellah, are there other activist anthropologists that you can think of that are moving the dial? Even those two are not known as activist anthropologists. Those who wade into a culture and work to make a change in that culture by working at it with their tools at that cultural level. Can you think of any activist anthropologists?
Yeah, I would say one of the most famous is Paul Farmer, and
Mhm.
he's famous as being a medical anthropologist. And part of what made his approach was seeing that there were these cultural and social interactions that were preventing medical care and services to be available, right? And so a lot of times people are trying to think logistics and moving equipment or getting the right trained people or training new people. But he came with that holistic perspective on, as societies, as communities, even as nation states, how are we working together as groups of humans, not as individuals, but as groups of humans trying to do things? And how often do habitual cultural patterns get in the way or can be leveraged and facilitate things happening? And he's been recognized internationally for changing an awful lot of, especially public health programs. And we can see that sometimes it takes fewer resources when you've got the humans aligned and thinking together and understanding who they are and what they're really trying to do. But also, as they're thinking about who they are and their cultural circumstances, what might work in one place clearly isn't going to work in another. The language is different, the the culture is different, the habits are different, the understandings of how those folks fit in their worlds is different. And if we don't respect that and even leverage that, then back to that unrealized potential, we really miss out on a lot and we can waste an awful lot of time and resources.
That's so true. In Denmark, there was one philosopher, Nikolai Grundtvig, and in about 1850, he got all the farmers organized so that 10 farmers could buy grain at the same price as one farmer. And he really set the stage for giving cooperation the benefit of the doubt. That's a whole state of mind. In the US, if I got to like mow the lawn or whatever, it's me. There's nobody else to do it. Maybe I can pay somebody. But in co housing, I'm just so amazed by how much we bifurcate the responsibilities. In other words, I'll do this and you do that, and acting on their highest and best use. Can you think of any anthropologists that have tried to morph the culture so that we could give cooperation the benefit of the doubt better in this culture? Because that's the one thing that we have to start from scratch.
Well, I would say that in a sense, that's part of what Paul Farmer was doing. We've also seen in communities where, like, their languages are threatened and are dying out. We see this in California, especially with a lot of the indigenous languages, and the community is trying to say, "Hey, we're losing our grip, we're losing our access to things." In these language revitalization efforts, when they start saying, "Oh, how do we do this as a whole group? How do we start with the kids and get them living in a place where the default is recognizing that you're not just you, but you're part of us?" Back to the we again. Even the language, recovering some of the kinds of languages or just sometimes favored terms helps remind people, oh, I'm from this group. So Leanne Hinton has been really great helping some of these communities recover their languages and their ways of life that often were rooted in a cooperative and collaborative way that we don't see highlighted as much in the States. I also, as a youth and a young adult, I worked on a farm. It was a Black Angus cattle farm back east in Massachusetts, and farmers cooperate. You might have heard of the Grange movement and things like that. This is something that we have, but we've lost, in part because the market and advertising systems distract us. And again, this is our habitual thing. If we're constantly inundated with messages about what can you buy for you rather than what do we all want to do, then it changes that way. And so it doesn't surprise me that this kind of collaboration came out of a rural background because farmers are constantly calling each other for help. And you'll go over and help with their harvest, and they turn around and help you with yours, and you're still all going off to sell in the same market.
It's a really good point that we had it. And Grange are still around, but they don't have anywhere near the role they once had.
No, no.
Once upon a time, Nevada County, where I live, produced 100% of their own beef. Now they produce less than 2%. And I attribute that to not knowing how to cooperate. They don't even have a butcher, for example, that they can call on.
Yeah, or even our regulations, so where many farmers might have used the same abattoir for processing their meat, they can't do that in the same way, and the regulations have sometimes been difficult when people have developed mobile ones to go to the different places, but we have this fixed idea of you can only do it one way in this kind of a place with this kind of sanitation conditions and not saying, "Well, is it really happening?" And yet we still have recalls for tainted products.
Right. You did right. There's a lot of activist business people that have pleasantly surprised me, for example, is the organic farming movement,
Mhm.
where they have taken certified organic farming from zero. It grows every year. And I'm surprised in co-housing where I live, it better be organic, basically. That's part of our subculture in that co-housing group and more in our town, no doubt about it. But anyway, that was a few individuals who got together and said, hey, we're going to get this certified. Well, interestingly enough, as soon as they got it certified, it really started to grow. In other words, people simply didn't trust previously that it was really organic. So I'm just so impressed by the micro movements, co-housing simply being another one.
When you were talking about this reminds me of the whole permaculture movement.
Yeah.
And permaculture and co-housing, I think are related concepts. And you'll remember that when we were building FrogSong, we wanted to landscape with what we called an edible landscape based on permaculture principles. And that's because every plot of land has its own particular longitude, latitude, watershed, and all the rest of it. And so you have to figure out what works in that place. And we spent a year living on that space and figuring out where are we going to put the fruit trees and the herbs and the vegetable garden because we had to know the space in order to grow the space. And I think we're like those living things. We have to figure out in that particular place what's going to work. And then it's healthier just naturally. In fact, it's the trees are just fruiting up like crazy right now. You can't walk down the pathway without stepping on a plum.
Now you have to worry about fire safe as a concept. You guys are so
Yeah,
overgrown. Yeah.
yeah, and we
Um,
are working on that.
the whole know it before you grow it. There's a reason that you guys, as a subculture, were willing to do what amounts to looks like 80% of the landscaping, if not 90% of the landscaping yourselves.
Yeah,
Studying it and understanding it for nearly a year, people got excited about doing things that they had never done before. I know some of those people hadn't grown much previously.
exactly. I mean, remember Will
Yeah.
with a jackhammer trying to break down through the clay because we were trying to get a tree in there, and he'd never been on a machine like that, and it was a riot. I think he was in his 70s at the time. The discovery too. I mean, the unanticipated but not entirely unexpected surprises that happen bring a lot of joy as well as effectiveness. And now we're looking at it after 23 years. And as you said, we're having to cull things out to see different kinds of things. I swear the seasons have changed enough that we're also having to change what kinds of plants are growing there. And the people, right? We want different things. What we wanted in the beginning, there's some new people that have come in since then. And so they want to add their own part to the mix, which is great.
And it was not only knowing enough about the landscape, but also knowing these people that they had worked so hard with for over a year to make a place. I mean,
Yeah.
there comes a time where you know each other, you care about each other, and you support each other. And when that day arrives, people are willing to move mountains together.
Yeah. Yeah.
And not only the landscaping, I mean, you got a very complicated project approved. That was the first mixed use in 30 years, for example.
Yeah.
And now there's mixed use all over Sonoma
Yeah.
County. I think you guys set a great stage there. You know, I've worked with the city of Cotati on other things, and they talk about that you guys broke the box. And
Yeah.
they were afraid of mixed use before you guys were built.
Yeah, and they were also afraid of letting people move in without their place landscaped because
Yeah.
normally.
You guys had to bond it.
Yeah, and we had to put down a $30,000 bond that they were gonna use to landscape it their way if they didn't like what we did, and as you said, we ended up becoming one of the places that the city manager and other folks would walk people through saying, "Hey, look what happened here," because they were willing to take a risk on us, but it took work. It took us
Yeah.
showing up and being there as a group, not even just individual people or our developer, or our architects, whatever. We had to show up as the future occupants saying, "This is where and how we wanna live, and don't you see how much you keep asking for this in your town?" And yet we were able to articulate what were the barriers that were getting in the way of making that happen, because it wasn't gonna happen by accident. Not anymore.
Yes, you guys had to do a lot of tilling of the soil metaphorically. I mean, just working with the neighbors, getting them to
Yeah.
relax about you doing your own landscaping.
Yeah.
Oh my god. It was like, really? They get so nervous about, "Oh, you wanna do the parking lot different. Oh, you wanna do the landscaping different," one thing after another. Today, if you're gonna have a high functioning neighborhood, you have to do it differently than the way we used
Yeah.
to do it. But anyway, you guys set the tone for making it happen.
I think part of this goes into people being able to talk and articulate, but in order to talk, you gotta listen. In order to get the city to listen to us, we actually had to learn to listen to them and see how they were framing what was their worry, what was their concern, what was their regulation that they felt like they needed us to do it one way and not another because they were afraid that our way wasn't going to match. And when we listened really closely and said, "Oh, wait a minute, if that's what you're worried about, do you see that this other approach does match it's just a different way of matching what your regulation wants, and so you can say yes to it," right? They're used to saying no because builders come in and try and get the most out of it and run and disappear, and they're not staying around. And that's what they're trying to protect everybody from, the town members as well as the future occupants. But when we were gonna be the future occupants, it took a lot of work before they finally realized, "Oh, you're like individual homeowners building an individual home, and we treat that differently than when you're doing a larger project where we're thinking, we don't know if these people will be back, and make sure they landscape because otherwise they're gonna disappear and just leave bare ground."
Yeah.
You know, they have good reasons.
No, they have a lot of experience being fleeced by developers and taken advantage of. Yeah. And all the codifications are designed to prevent that. And, you know, co-housing groups get caught up in the snare. But that said, everybody marveled about the fact that we finished FrogSong in 3 years.
Yep, on time, under budget.
The senior co-housing right next door, which is a fine project, took 5 years.
Yeah,
And that's the difference between having future residents who knew how to articulate their needs, wants, and desires, and having a developer, Burbank Housing, articulate their needs, wants, and desires. And the single family houses next door, built also at the same time, was
yep,
7 years.
yeah,
I talked to that developer several times, and he marveled at how he was told to change things over and over, and he felt like he had no choice. He put in a mom up at the podium and says, "We worked on this over 2 weekends, and this is how we really want it." And then you say, "Why wouldn't you approve it?" It gets really complicated for them to say no,
yeah,
you
yeah.
know? And that was one of the things that made that project gratifying because I don't know any co-housing group who wants to take 5 or 7 years, and so they make a case for themselves and create this criteria that's simply better. You know, Robert Bellah in Habits of the Heart, what do you think about his ability to help us imagine being communitarians again?
I think key to this is something that's key to a lot of the way I study humans and how they use language, and it's in that title, habits, right? You don't suddenly do a habit perfectly from day one. It takes constant nurturing and building and retrying, but if you keep your eye on the prize and don't want perfection, but are willing to say, "I just want something better," that habituated form of, "We're gonna keep working on this, we're gonna keep trying to stay open, we're gonna keep trying to say what moved us to do it to begin with," and then even as we get into it, "Ooh, it's not doing what we thought it was gonna." Sometimes it's a pleasant surprise, and you just embrace it instead of, "It wasn't what we're going for," right? But if you also are willing to say, "It's still not working, and why?" And that self-reflective thing of saying, despite intentions, what keeps us from doing things? Are there things that keep reinforcing the behavior that we don't want? Can we modify that, right? What's the sort of environmental conditions that keep habituating us into one way instead of another? So if you find like-minded people, or if you develop habits of presence and appreciation and gratitude, right? The more you slow down and see that, the easier it is to catch when it's going off the rails, or to see an opening for something new, or to hear from somebody else a new suggestion, right? And again, I think one of the important things that I've learned, sometimes the hard way, is I didn't listen deeply enough or hard enough, or I anticipated what I thought the person was going to be saying rather than wait for it to come out, right? And anybody who's been in a long-term relationship knows this is one of our ongoing challenges too, right? And I've been married since 85. And even after all these decades, we still run into the, "Wait, you aren't hearing me." And so the habits of the heart really is reminding us that that's where we need to be coming from. And it requires acceptance as well as even revealing to people what you need,
Hmm.
because sometimes if it's not revealed, it festers and that causes the trouble. When often just a simple assistance early on, because you are able to talk to each other, you're able to express, when I was going through chemo and all the stuff that brought in, letting my community know about that just meant that the floodgates opened in terms of support.
Mhm.
And,
That's great.
you know, that's hard to beat. That's really hard to
Yeah,
beat.
you can't beat it. When you mentioned listening, whenever I give a public presentation, at least one person will say, who thrives in co-housing? Who moves into co-housing? What's the personality type? For one thing, somebody sometimes will say like-minded people, and I argue, having worked with 55 co-housing now, there's no such thing as like-minded people, because they're
Mhm.
so thoughtful and discerning that they have their own points of view, and that's great. But the two things they do seem to have, one is the people who move in co-housing have to be good listeners. I mean, the way I argue it is you either are a good listener or you're highly motivated to learn how to be a good listener,
Bingo. Bingo.
or you're not a good listener and you recognize that soon and you kind of drop out. I've had plenty of groups where once we get started, lawyers have a hard time. They're not used to listening to other people. They sometimes get frustrated and drop out of the project. And of course, we try to help them imagine it. We do different workshops. I know you guys did it too around nonviolent communication and such, and try to figure out if I really want to live here and I really want to learn how to be a listener, because basic co-housing math is I have an idea, you have an idea, and the third idea that we come up with is the better
Mhm.
of the three. And you can't get to 3 if you don't listen. If you're just waiting for others to accept your point of view, I argue over and over again that the point of argument and discussion is not about figuring out win or lose, it's about figuring out the best solution.
Yeah, and back to habits, it's having that be a habitual way of dealing with things, like, so and so isn't gonna be sent off to solve this problem. Whoever's interested or has energy can join in and work on it. The
Preferably
folks that
both.
don't have it,
Yeah,
they don't get involved sometimes at that
right.
point, but then it comes to the community, whether at a community meeting or discussions across the table at a common meal, and it ends up being a sort of iterative process always. It captures the energy without forcing everybody to have to sit through all of it, right? We gravitate toward what we care about. We have all the different committees for the different things because some people are green thumbs and like to work in the garden. Some folks are on the maintenance committee because they like to fix things. We have our facilitators who just like to make a meeting work well and be fun and have people at the end of the meeting go, I like that meeting, and we don't get that in our work environments often, right? But when people are crafting the meetings together, and carefully balancing in conscious ways, they're paying attention to how we're gonna communicate and interact. And, "Oh, this is a hard topic, we gotta follow it with this, or we've gotta set it up with something that's gonna remind us that we're in this together before we then face the thing." But if our relationships are reinforced right before that, it's so much easier to pass the annual budget when we talk about all the things that we got to do that worked well, and so it brings down the anxiety and opens up the creativity.
Yeah, and there's so many little things that happen that help you learn to listen. For example, I'll never forget moving into Nevada City co-housing, and there was one chap I had a hard time understanding where he was coming from over and over again. Then I cooked common dinner with him, and I realized I wasn't listening well enough and found out what an amazing cook he was and I've just appreciated him immensely as a person. I found that after that experience, it was so much easier to listen, learn, and understand where he was coming from. And there's all of these little incentives, including somebody did a great job facilitating. You raise a really good point about these committees that are hybrid. One person's okay with the finances, and one person is happy to do landscaping. And that hybridness, and not only learning to listen, but even defer to others. Okay, if you think that's the best tree, I'm not going to argue with you. Let's just do it. They made a good case.
We develop respect for each other.
Yeah.
And again, respect comes from listening and getting to know people. But you end up realizing that we all aren't experts on everything. And I think that this is actually a recurring problem in our society at large. We've come to be not just skeptical of, but suspicious of experts. And we forget that experts are people who have delved into something, really learned it to the point where they get to the understandings that go beyond common sense, right? That's when you know you're dealing with an expert. Oh, you'd think this would be the right answer, but enough experience, enough knowledge, the common sense thing doesn't take into account some things. And whether it's the right plant in the right place, or whether it's the right social move at the right time when people are anxious, right? A really good therapist or a really good facilitator will see something and go, "Hey, let's take a break." And then suddenly things move. That's not common sense, that's experience. And
Yeah.
experts have complex experience. One of the things I love is we have a range of expertise. Again, that diversity, we are not the same. And when you're experts in all kinds of different things, then you're going to have different worldviews. And thank goodness for that. We end up with much better solutions than if all the same folks were calling all the same shots.
Right. And along those lines, if you walk around your co-housing communities, it is scaled so humanely. I mean, the kids are comfortable there, the adults are comfortable there, cars are not comfortable there between the houses. They're on the periphery. So many smart decisions along the way. That was a 30-page design criteria that we came up with together over 2 days on one weekend and then 2 evenings. And when you talk about habits of the heart and sort of embracing a concept together, literally 40 plus people at every one of those meetings, we would spend 15 to 20 minutes having a good conversation about each line item. Then we've agreed we're going to do 45 parking places. There was no more arguing about it. We didn't look back until you guys lived there, and who knows what kind of morphing that you've wanted to do since then. But I bet it wasn't that much.
And yeah, not all that much, and we realized, at one point we were asking too much in terms of the landscape load, and finally the landscape committee realized, "Oh, well, we can add into our annual budget some hours to bring somebody in to do some of this stuff that just has to be done all the time." And as some of us are aging, we're not physically as capable. We have a paid person doing it, and then the rest of the work, I mean, we just had a landscape weekend this past weekend. We also learned big, long days didn't always work. make it, so we've changed the patterns, and so across a weekend, you can come on one morning or the other morning, and it's just for a few hours, and it's not a marathon. So we revisit our decisions, and we tweak them and make them better. We stop doing some things, we add new things. Again, it's that adaptation. We're never gonna get it perfect because there will be different people, and even the same people will be changing in ages and stages. So our needs are gonna be changing. And as you know, I mean, we're getting into the aging in place issues, and how do we work on that?
Right.
And I'm hopeful.
Well, I can't imagine a neighborhood being more responsive than your neighborhood, frankly. You guys do things. For example, we had a 30-page book for the site design. We had a 30-page book for the private house design. And then we had a 30-page book for the common house design. And the common house, you guys came up with the criteria with me, and then we came up with a design. That's fine. But you guys have morphed it since you've moved in.
Yeah, we built in that whole second level in the kids' room area and opening up that space that had just been some storage or whatever, and now that's a third functioning room. And what was fun was we got an artist who does metal sculpture, and that was the person who did the railings and banister.
The loft.
So we didn't just even have to have it be off the shelf materials. We had a little extra money that we could throw into it, because people were willing to spend it to do something creative. I think that was the same guy that did the play structure outside. So that added an organic element to it that we couldn't have imagined when we were first designing the common house. And we've also reworked the space above the workshop, and we're about to rework it again just to make it more functional.
But what you guys could imagine is how to work together. That's fundamental.
Yeah.
I mean, you almost take it for granted, I would guess now. We better have a good facilitator and we will brainstorm, discuss, and decide a solution
Mhm.
that works for this touchy item. And, so much of your habits are antithetical or an anathema to regular neighborhoods who have a harder time. We share probably about 150 different things together
Mhm.
that it's all designed to make my life easier, more convenient, more practical, more economical, more interesting, more fun, etc. And it just becomes the logical default behavior. And it
Mhm.
seems like that's what's happening at Cotati too.
Well, that gets to that point about how interdependence actually creates more autonomy, right? The fact that we're all not having to have a lawnmower and a garage full of stuff or whatever. We've got the workshop that everybody shares. We've got the pickup truck that the whole community has, so we can go down to one vehicle, because we have that functional one for the few times that you need something bigger. And then we can use that money somewhere else. I just bought a baritone saxophone that I wouldn't have been able to afford if I had to keep a whole, single family suburban house going with everything that would be in the garage, right? And so we see people doing that. They can turn their resources to what they like to do and add enrichment to their life.
We did a study at our office that showed I, for example, save about $1,000 a month living in co-housing. We have one shared internet, which is about $10 a month compared to the individual internets that you would have to buy in this town that run $95 a month, etc. Have you guys thought about how much you save living in co-housing?
I remember doing those numbers shortly after moving in and realizing even within the first 5 years, it had already started to really help. But I haven't done a calculation in a long time, in part because I feel abundance. I'm not worried about my budget. Trying to make ends meet hasn't been a concern for a while. Now, some of that's privilege of having a safe, secure job, but both of us had been working when our daughter was youngest, right? I remember as junior faculty, and my wife was running teacher training programs for school gardens and then later became a teacher. Life was full, life was busy, but the shared meals brought the cost of eating down, and it also brought the tax on your energy, right? Once a month, you can really get into it as part of a cook team or as a lead cook, and you spend 2 or 3 times maybe on the menu work and 2 or 3 times maybe than you would on the prep, but then you've got 20 other meals that come to you where you just get to walk in and somebody else has already done that, and so yeah, after the first several years, I had better things to do than go do some accounting.
Mhm.
Um,
I got you. But we simply take it for granted. I mean, like you said, you start to spend more time and money on personal items because you have the excess cash, or you save up, or you make sure your daughter has everything she needs. My daughter's getting married, so I'm trying to
congratulations.
figure out all of her needs at this juncture, but it's fun. It's super fun.
Well, and then, again, living lighter on the earth, it's so much easier. We have what's called a VFB, virtual free box, right? And so we'll put something out by email saying, "Does anybody want this?" It's snapped up, so it's not going into landfill. Somebody else is getting it. There's been times when we've had a piece of furniture or two for 5 or 10 or 15 years, and then we get to a point where we don't want it. We put it out. Somebody else picks it up. And it's fun going into each other's homes and seeing, or didn't that used to be Ellen's? And likewise, in search of, you're suddenly in need, you're going camping for a weekend and you realize one of the folks in your group doesn't have a sleeping pad, right? And you put out the call, and sometimes, I mean, quite literally within seconds, there'll be a knock at the door saying, "Hey, I got one of these. You want it?" And so you buy a lot less because you're sharing those items too.
That's perfect. I mean, we have a one garage that's just dedicated to ski equipment. I mean, virtually nobody who moves in here has to buy any ski equipment. We have 20, 30 pairs of skis, 40, 50 pairs of boots. It just goes, it's quite exhaustive. And it's one less parking place, but we don't worry about it because we share a car and such.
And this gets back to, we're all habitually talking with each other, communicating with each other. What's your need or what's my offer? And by already being in those relationships and having those structures already there, it takes very little effort to do things that would otherwise be harder. So there isn't that extra
Logistics
burden. Yeah, the logistics and the energy and resources that go into that.
and the time and the scheduling and the phone calls and
Yeah,
just
yeah,
goes on and on.
yeah.
Proximity plays a huge role, and you guys are 30 units on 2.2 acres. I mean, you're a village. You feel like a village there.
Although, what's interesting, often in the co-housing literature and conversations, we hear, us, like, talking about we're recovering the old village,
Yeah.
and as an anthropologist, I look at this and I go, "Well, yeah, but not quite," right? Because what we're actually doing is looking at what made those villages work when they worked, but something kept it from happening or things changed enough. If the old stuff would continue to work, we'd still be doing it, right? We're drawing on old knowledge, old experience, wisdom. So I think we are informed by our notions of village, but these are new villages. So we are doing something new still.
Yeah.
And that's great, right? Because they're going to work in the current times. And as we look ahead to the future, those villages can be optimized for the future that we're living into, which is going to have a very different set of challenges.
Well, the folks who started co-housing in Denmark were very clear about the fact that we need to make something that, in their case, worked for the late 20th century. What are our lives really about now, the early 21st century? Do I like being on the road all the time? Do I like consuming all this gas, spending all this money? No. Let's see how we can play a role in morphing that. I had dinner at a senior co-housing, and one of the residents says, "Chuck, you should know that for 20 years, I bought 4 or 5 tanks of gas a month. And now, since I've been living here for the last 2 years, I buy less than 1 tank of gas a month." So that not only addressed his pocketbook, but very much addressed his other values about not polluting, etc.
And I think COVID taught us an awful lot. And we finally realized remote working can be far more effective than a lot of people thought it could be. It has its constraints. Co-housing, in some ways, it's a perfect place for anybody who works remotely part-time or full-time. It has its constraints, but if they're living in co-housing, they're not isolated, as we saw happen during COVID. And it was very interesting during COVID where the world at large was really wrestling with loneliness. We were able to get together and do things. We would sit outside with distance, but we had common space, right? And there were many ways that we were far less isolated than the folks just down the street from us because we had the communication lines and the shared spaces to do things set up before the crisis hit. And so we just used them slightly differently. And, I'm not expecting necessarily another pandemic to come through, but we've seen other issues, fires. Okay, when the wildfires were happening in Sonoma County, we really supported each other, right? We do earthquake preparedness together, and we have all kinds of resources, including especially a number of people who are knowledgeable about what we should be doing, and they won't be panicking. They'll be guiding the rest of us who might be wigging out a little bit, but whatever it turns out to be, we'll be able to do it together.
Cooperation is such a watershed, frankly. The
Mhm,
extent that people can cooperate, you create a whole nother mechanism for living.
mhm.
It's like the difference between an automobile and walking. Bicycle brings a whole system together of a cooperating chain and tires and all the rest. But I'm saying it's a tool. Cooperation is a meaningful tool for a more pleasant life, in my opinion. You brought up loneliness. Prior to the pandemic, Psychology Today wrote an incredible story about how pathologically lonely Americans over 55 were. About 40% of our seniors were chronically lonely. I mean, go whole days without chatting with another human being. Since the pandemic, it's considered to be 50%. I mean, I know that co-housing has a means of mitigating that, but, getting people to imagine it and accept it as a quality of life is the challenge.
Well, it is amazing. It happened just again this past weekend. Some neighbors of ours had a wedding, and so some of the family were staying at FrogSong in our guest rooms. And they commented afterwards, just how wonderful it felt to be in a place like this. And time again, if anybody stays, they feel it palpably. And, we could describe and we could explain and advocate for it, but there really is nothing like just staying in it for a few days. Another single mom who recently moved into the community, her parents were visiting, and they expressed multiple times how wonderful it felt to them to see that their grandchildren had a place like this. And they had been a little bit skeptical when their daughter was saying, "Hey, I wanna move into this unit. It doesn't even have its own yard." It's one of the ones above the commercial space where, we have those apartments up there. They were wondering, and then they came and they saw the kids playing with the other kids and the adults playing with the kids, and just the palpability of that enjoyment is I don't think there's anything that matches it. So I think that that's why even just tours coming through can help people see differently. But we also, a lot of us, if we're going to go on an extended vacation or travel, we try to rent a place for a month or 2 or 6 to people who are thinking about co-housing. Like when I lived in Sweden, right? We rented our place. And so that ended up with a couple who hadn't really been looking to move in ended up staying, and we've seen that with other folks. Sometimes they end up at different co-housing communities. Sometimes they help found other communities, but it helps them realize, yes, this is something. It's not just an interesting idea. You can see what it feels like. And to be honest, that's part of what it felt like for me when I lived over in Sweden. When we talk about a lot of the social programs that are get political resistance here, and I saw how it worked over there. It wasn't perfect. It was not a utopia. You've lived in Scandinavia yourself, but to see it functioning pretty well helped make it easier when I came back and said, "Yeah, we're not living illusions. We can do more of this kind of stuff." And I do think it is where we gotta be going for all kinds of reasons.
Now, the last time I was there, I donated a couple books to your library. And of course, normally I would say loan those visitors out a copy of the book. But everybody says nobody reads anymore. It is waning a bit. That's why I
Mhm.
started this podcast. And I think the tours are another good approach, but that's not going to hit the mass market.
Well, people may be reading less and, as a university professor, I see those challenges as the students come in, but I still think that once somebody gets onto something, right, when they're interested, they will read a lot more, especially about that particular thing, and they might not think of themselves as a reader, but when they get the bug so resources, especially if we're mindful about how we format them, do we put lots of dense text or do we provide some diagrams and photographs and other stuff to make it accessible? People still like books.
They do. And that's important.
Yeah, and so reading is still there, but it's there with podcasts and everything else now.
I argue that actually takes 2 things to move into co-housing. 1, you've gotta know how to listen, and 2, you gotta be able to read. Because, I work with a lot of groups, and I find that the dozen or 2 people in the group who have read Creating Co-housing or Co-housing Communities, they just have such a leg up on the process. They see that it's about brainstorming, discussing, and how to discuss in an equitable way, and then how to decide, and they just build the project, themselves together, not brick by brick, but decision by decision, because they have enough background in the topic. Actually, the last 2 books I've written, one of them, Co-housing Communities, it's got 900 photos and 900 captions, and I find that if people just go through it, look at the photos, takes about 15 minutes, and then read the captions, and that takes about an hour, and then reads the text that they're interested in. In other words, you kind of have to write books a little differently now, and I'm okay with it. I'm embracing that.
Mhm. It's like curating a museum exhibit, right?
Yeah, right.
You got something that pulls somebody in and then enough text, and then nowadays, often through some electronic device, you can read further, click here. The way we discover is changing, certainly.
That's a good point. I think I should come up with a headset for giving people tours of our co-housing, because if I have to describe one more time how we came up with where the houses are located, it's a funny, fascinating story. I'm going to think about that. Richard, beyond what you've already described, how has co-housing affected the lives of your family, would you say?
I think it has very deeply enriched it. The quality plays out daily. Having moved through a couple of decades now, and even my own physicality is changing, it just keeps opening up new things. The joy of watching that cohort of kids that moved in with us now finding partners and getting married and finding places in the world, they are still so linked to each other. I think I mentioned in a phone call about how they talk about each other as siblings. And they don't think of it as virtual siblings. They literally use sibling terminology when introducing themselves to each other's friends. And even seeing some of them saying, I want to build the kind of place that I grew up. And one of them's in San Francisco trying to find other folks. And that cannot possibly be the same kind of thing in Cotati, right? But he's seen the value of it, and I watch so many of them blossoming in different ways, going in paths we couldn't possibly have imagined, and the joy of just watching their lives, that's way up there. It's hard to say much more than that. Our family is tighter because our community was tighter, right?
Makes sense. I mean, because your daughter didn't have to go off-site all the times to commune with other people her age, which would
Right.
have, you know
Yeah, the autonomy that those kids learned, and they're doing all kinds of absolutely amazing things. With Sonia in Lisbon, Corey's bicycling the world, and they keep in touch with us. Even staying at home, we get to experience those kids out in the world.
Hmm. There was an article in my last newsletter about the 50-year anniversary for the second co-housing finished in Denmark in 1973, and there must have been 80 kids at that reunion, and they still stay connected. I interviewed a lot of those kids when they were teenagers. Now they're older and wiser, but still connected, which is beautiful.
Yeah.
That was really, really beautiful. We moved in with my daughter was 12 or 13 to this co-housing with 37 kids, and it feels like she has 36 cousins.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the model of co-housing gives us more than architecture, as you have always mentioned. It's not that it would have been impossible without it, but the language that we use really helps us build relationships as well as the physical communities. And it will develop differently for each different community. So you have to be willing to have it be different from the previous communities. You build your community, you build your concepts, you build references that mean stuff to you, and you will develop your own language. I think the language and the framing is really important, and we have to keep rediscovering that for each different co-housing community and each country when we figure out how do we get the language for where we are?
Well, I hope you'll come on again, Richard, and keep a note of other things that we didn't talk about because I think it's going to be another rich experience having another podcast with you.
I would be happy to.
If this conversation resonated with you at all, please consider subscribing, rating this episode, and sharing it with somebody interested in living in a sustainable neighborhood where people know each other, care about each other, and support each other. As always, you can find more information about everything we discussed in this episode in the description, along with our website where you can find events, our newsletter, latest books like Neuro-Inclusive Community Design. Thank you to our production team here at the Co-Housing Company, Natachai Kongojoran Kitsuk and Melissa Turnbull. And Richard, thank you so much, man.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and don't hesitate to call.
Well, you're more than welcome. And until next time, I'm Charles Durrett. My email is charles.durrett@cohousingco.com. Thanks for being part of today's conversation.